Seriously, they're letting anyone fly these days, Marcus said, his voice dripping with theatrical disdain. Must have won a lottery ticket for that seat. One of his friends snickered. Look at that backpack, probably got her life savings in there, or a bunch of snacks she snuck past security. The laughter was the first thing she noticed. Not the warm, shared kind that fills a room with light, but the sharp, metallic sort that sliced through the cabin's polite hum. It was aimed downward, from the plush leather cocoons of business class toward the cramped, utilitarian grid of economy, and it was aimed directly at her. Dr. Aris Thorne kept her eyes on the worn paperback in her hands, its spine cracked and its pages soft with use. She didn't need to look up to see the source. She'd felt his gaze since she stepped onto the jet bridge, a heavy, appraising stare that catalogued her simple black hoodie, her faded jeans, and the scuffed, overstuffed backpack she carried instead of a sleek roller bag. His name, she'd overheard him boom into his phone, was Marcus. He was dressed in the unofficial uniform of New Money, a designer tracksuit that cost more than her rent, pristine white sneakers, and a watch that glittered with smug confidence every time he gestured. He and his two colleagues were now leaning over their partition pods, champagne flutes in hand, their voices a low, condescending murmur meant to be overheard. Seriously, they're letting anyone fly these days, Marcus said, his voice dripping with theatrical disdain. Must have won a lottery ticket for that seat. One of his friends snickered. Look at that backpack, probably got her life savings in there, or a bunch of snacks she snuck past security. Aris slowly turned a page, the crisp sound of the paper a small act of defiance in the pressurized air. She was in seat 12F, a window seat just behind the curtain that separated the worlds. For them, it was a barrier of privilege. For her, it was just a curtain. She had chosen the seat deliberately. It was directly over the portside wing root, where the engine pylon met the fuselage. From here, she could observe the wing's flexion during takeoff and feel the engine's unique harmonic signature. It was a habit she'd never broken, a private conversation with the machines she understood better than most people. A flight attendant, her smile bright but brittle, offered Aris a pre-flight water with the same efficient, impersonal gesture she offered everyone in her section. But when she turned to address Marcus and his friends, her posture shifted. She became warmer, more deferential, her smile reaching her eyes. Can I get you gentlemen another glass of champagne before we take off? Absolutely, Marcus said, handing her his glass without making eye contact. His gaze was still fixed on the economy section, a king surveying a territory he found distasteful. Aris pulled her backpack closer, settling it beneath the seat in front of her. It was heavy, its canvas sides bulging with not snacks, but 2 encrypted hard drives, a portable spectral analyzer, and the technical schematics for the G-1 billion engine currently bolted to the wing outside her window. Her life's work wasn't in the bag. Her work gave life to the very machine they were all sitting in. The irony was a familiar, weary companion. She had designed the engine's primary turbine blades, crafted the proprietary alloy that could withstand temperatures of 2,000 degrees Celsius, and written the diagnostic software that monitored its performance with 1,000 invisible checks per second. She was more connected to this aircraft than anyone on board, including the pilots. But in this floating hierarchy of humanity, she was just a black woman in a cheap seat, an object of casual contempt, a nobody in 12F. She leaned her head against the cool plastic of the window, watching the ground crew scurry below like ants. The engines began to spool up, their low whine escalating into a deep, familiar roar. Aris closed her eyes, not in prayer but in communion. She felt the vibrations travel through the floor, up her seat, and into her bones. She listened. And then she felt it. A subtle tremor, a ghost in the machine. A tiny, discordant note in a symphony she knew by heart. It was almost imperceptible, a flutter so faint that 99% of people would have dismissed it as a bump in the tarmac. But to her, it was a whisper of something wrong. Something no one else could possibly feel. The plane began its powerful roll down the runway, and as it lifted into the sky, the whisper didn't fade. It held, a single, persistent, and terrifying note. The world snapped into its prescribed order the moment the plane reached 30,000 feet. The seatbelt sign pinged off, and the flight attendant drew the flimsy blue curtain, a threadbare veil separating the realms of the chosen from the masses. On one side, the clink of real glass, the murmur of relaxed conversation, and the scent of warm nuts being served on porcelain plates. On Eris's side, the crinkle of plastic-wrapped headphones, the dense smell of recycled air, and the resigned quiet of passengers settling in for a long, cramped journey. Marcus's voice, now lubricated by more champagne, easily bled through the curtain. "It's a different world back there, isn't it?" he said to his companions, his volume a deliberate performance. "They should be grateful just to be on the plane. You see them shuffling on with their giant bags, no concept of etiquette." Eris ignored him. She pulled her tablet from her backpack, the screen flaring to life with not a movie or a game, but a cascade of differential equations modeling fluid dynamics under extreme thermal stress. It was her work, but it was also her sanctuary. In the clean, predictable world of physics, there were no hierarchies, no prejudices. There were only principles. Stresses, vectors, and velocities were honest. They couldn't lie or sneer. They simply were. The drink cart rattled down the aisle, operated by a flight attendant whose smile seemed to lose 10 watts of power the moment it crossed the curtain. "Drink?" she asked Eris, her tone flat. "Just water, no ice, please." The attendant handed her a plastic cup and moved on. A moment later, through a gap in the curtain, Eris saw the same attendant pouring wine into a real glass for Marcus, leaning in to laugh at a joke he'd made. He was telling a story about a recent acquisition, his voice laced with the casual cruelty of a man who had never been told no. "It's the whole equity push," he declared, loud enough for half the economy cabin to hear. "Suddenly, you have to consider candidates who aren't a good culture fit. It's about lowering standards so everyone gets a turn to play. But some people just aren't built for the big leagues." This time, a few passengers in the rows near Eris shifted uncomfortably. An older woman shot a brief, sympathetic glance her way, but no one said anything. The unspoken rules of air travel, of modern life, really, were clear. You do not engage. You retreat into your tiny, allotted space and pretend not to hear. Eris didn't pretend. She simply filtered it out. The sound of his voice was just another frequency, less important than the low, persistent hum of the engine outside her window. That hum was where her attention remained. The vibration she'd felt on the runway hadn't disappeared. It was still there, a subtle, rhythmic thrumming that was just a few hertz off from the engine's optimal resonant frequency. It was like listening to a world-class orchestra and hearing a single violin string that was infinitesimally flat. Only a master conductor would notice. On her tablet, she pulled up a diagnostic overlay of the GENX-1 BTK's internal structure. She ran a quick simulation, inputting the plane's current speed, altitude, and the ambient temperature. A tiny node on the schematic, representing the primary load-bearing pylon connecting the engine to the wing, began to pulse with a faint, almost invisible yellow light. The software was flagging a potential stress coefficient anomaly. It was a 1 in a million possibility, a ghost in the data that any other engineer would dismiss as a sensor error. But Eris trusted her feelings and her math more than she trusted statistical likelihoods. The vibration, combined with the data, pointed to a single, terrifying conclusion: a potential cascade failure originating from a resonant stress fracture. She looked up as the flight attendant passed again. "Excuse me," Eris said, her voice calm and even. "I was just wondering, have the pilots reported any unusual EGT fluctuations on Engine 1, the exhaust gas temperature?" The flight attendant stared at her, her expression a perfect blank. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the context. A passenger in economy was trying to talk about the plane's mechanics. "Ma'am, if you're nervous about flying, I can assure you everything is perfectly normal," she said, her voice layered with practiced condescension. "Can I get you another water?" "I'm not nervous," Eris said, but the attendant was already moving down the aisle, her duty to placate the ignorant passenger fulfilled. Eris turned back to her window. The dismissal was total. She was invisible. She took a slow, deep breath, the cold reality settling in. She was the only person on this plane who knew they were in danger, and no one would believe her. She calmly closed the equations on her tablet and unzipped the main compartment of her backpack. Her fingers brushed against the cool metal casing of the spectral analyzer. She was no longer just observing, she was preparing to act. The hum was no longer just a sound, it was a presence. It vibrated up through the soles of her feet, a low, predatory growl that the plane's other noises couldn't quite mask. Eris knew that every engine has a voice, a unique acoustic signature. The G-Inx-1B was known for its deep, steady baritone. This was different. This was a voice growing hoarse, a sign of strain in its metallic throat. She slid the spectral analyzer from her backpack with the slow, deliberate movements of a bomb disposal expert. It was a compact device, no larger than a thick paperback, with a small optical sensor on one end. To anyone else, it was a meaningless black box. To Eris, it was an ear that could hear the sound of metal screaming in frequencies far beyond human perception. She couldn't get a direct reading from inside the cabin, but she could get an indirect one. She powered it on beneath the thin airline blanket, the small screen casting a faint green glow on her hands. Then, with practiced subtlety, she held her phone against the window, angling its camera to capture the reflection of the wing against the dark, churning clouds below. She held the analyzer's sensor up to her phone screen. The device would analyze the light patterns reflected off the wing's surface, measuring the microscopic vibrations that were invisible to the naked eye. It was a crude, improvised method, but it was the only one she had. For a full minute, she held perfectly still, ignoring the passenger next to her who was now giving her sideways glances. The device beeped softly, the analysis complete. Eris looked at the screen and her blood ran cold. The data was a jagged red line spiking across a field of calm green. It was a scream in the data, a clear signature of metallurgic fatigue. Her initial hunch was no longer a theory, it was a fact, rendered in terrifyingly precise mathematics. The harmonic resonance from the engine was exploiting a microscopic flaw in the pylon, shaking it apart molecule by molecule. They weren't just flying through turbulence. They were flying in a machine that was slowly, methodically, breaking up around them. They had hours, maybe less, before the stress reached a critical point. She knew she had to try again. She pressed the call button above her head. The same flight attendant arrived, her patience visibly thinner. Yes. Eris held up her tablet, showing the diagnostic screen with the pulsing yellow node. "I need you to give this to the captain," she said, her voice low but firm. "It's a thermal stress analysis. Look, this is the engine pylon. It's showing a resonant frequency cascade. The entire wing assembly is at risk of structural failure." The flight attendant stared at the screen, her eyes glazing over at the complex data. Then her gaze flickered to the strange black box in Eris's lap. She saw not a scientist providing critical information, but a nervous flyer with a gadget, creating a problem where there was none. "Ma'am," she said, her voice taking on the sharp, patronizing tone one uses with a difficult child. "I'm going to have to ask you to put that away. Unauthorized electronic devices are not permitted, and frankly, you're making the other passengers uncomfortable." Right on cue, Marcus's voice boomed from behind the curtain. "What's going on back there? Did she bring her ghost hunting kit on board?" His friends howled with laughter. Eris looked at the attendant, her expression pleading, "Please, just show it to the pilot. My name is Dr. Eris Thorne. He can verify my credentials. I designed." "I don't care if you designed the whole plane," the attendant snapped, her professional mask finally cracking. "You are a passenger. Now put it away, or I will have the captain speak to you when we land." Just as she finished her sentence, the plane gave a violent, sickening lurch. It wasn't a shudder this time, it was a drop. A collective gasp filled the cabin as they fell several hundred feet in a matter of seconds before the engines roared in protest and the plane leveled out, trembling. Drinks sloshed. A few people screamed. The fastened seatbelt sign flashed on with an aggressive, insistent chime. Marcus's laughter was instantly silenced. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, and this time the calm, folksy drawl was gone. It was clipped, tight, and all business. "Folks, this is your captain speaking. We've hit some unexpected and severe shear. We're asking everyone to remain in their seats with your belts securely fastened. Flight attendants, suspend service and secure the cabin immediately." The flight attendant who had just dismissed Eris looked pale, her hand gripping the back of a seat to steady herself. Her eyes met Eris's for a fleeting second, a flicker of doubt now mingling with the annoyance. But it was too late. She hurried off to follow the captain's orders. Eris leaned back in her seat, the spectral analyzer heavy in her lap. She had the answer. She had the proof. But the system was designed to keep her silent, to value the uniform of a flight attendant over the life's work of a lead engineer. The front door was locked and bolted. They had given her no other choice. If she was going to save them, she would have to break the rules. And she would have to find a back door into the cockpit. The atmosphere in the cabin had curdled. The forced politeness of commercial air travel had evaporated, replaced by a raw, collective anxiety. Passengers gripped their armrests, their faces pale in the dim light. Every slight bump of air sent a ripple of fear through the rows. The flight attendants, their smiles now tight, disciplined masks, moved through the aisles with a forced, brisk efficiency, their movements betraying the tension they were trying to conceal. They were preparing for a crisis, and their training had taken over. This was the world Eris now had to operate in, a sealed tube of escalating fear, where any deviation from the norm would be seen not as helpful, but as a threat. She kept the blanket over her lap, shielding her screen from casual view. Her encrypted laptop was a military-grade machine, matte black and featureless, designed not to draw attention. She powered it on, the screen booting directly into a secure operating system, bypassing the usual commercial interface. There were no icons, no desktop wallpaper, just a single blinking cursor in the top left corner of a black screen. Her fingers found the keyboard, moving with a speed and confidence that was hypnotic. She wasn't browsing or typing a document. She was writing code, her hands a blur of motion as she built a direct, secure tunnel into the airline's internal maintenance network. It was a system known only to a handful of senior engineers and emergency strategists. She knew it because she had helped design its protocols. She had a digital key to a kingdom no one on this plane knew existed. From behind the curtain, Marcus's nervous bravado had started to return. Fear, for men like him, often manifested as anger and blame. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice a pitch higher than before. "Unacceptable. This is what happens when you cut costs on maintenance. I'll be speaking to my lawyer as soon as we land." He then noticed the faint glow from Eris's screen. "What is she doing?" He hissed to his friend, craning his neck. "Is she on a laptop? They told us to turn everything off. Maybe she's the one causing this, trying to hack the plane's Wi-Fi or something." His comment was a spark in a room full of fumes. The passenger next to Eris, a nervous-looking man in a wrinkled suit, leaned away from her as if she were radioactive. He caught the eye of the lead flight attendant, who was now marching down the aisle. "Ma'am." The attendant's voice was sharp, cutting through the low hum of the cabin. She pointed a trembling finger at Eris's laptop. "I told you, all large electronic devices must be stowed. Now, you are violating federal aviation regulations and you are endangering this aircraft." The accusation was loud, public, and absolute. Eris didn't look up. Her eyes remained locked on the stream of data flowing across her screen. She had found it, the live telemetry from Engine 1. The numbers confirmed her visual analysis. The resonant vibrations were approaching the final threshold. The pylon was beginning to shear. "Ma'am, did you hear me? I will not ask you again," the attendant insisted, her hand reaching for the laptop. Eris finally looked up, and the quiet intensity in her eyes made the woman pause. "Telling me to turn off this laptop," Eris said, her voice dangerously calm, "is the single most dangerous thing you could do right now. You are not facing turbulence. You are facing imminent catastrophic structural failure of the port side engine pylon. In approximately 12 minutes, the engine will detach from the wing. You need to inform the captain of that immediately." The flight attendant recoiled, her face a mask of disbelief and anger. "That's it. You're done." She turned, ready to report the unhinged passenger in 12F to the cockpit, but Eris wasn't speaking to her anymore. Her world had shrunk to the screen, to the numbers that told a story of impending disaster. She had bypassed the local server. She was in. A small, secure messaging window opened on her screen. The recipient address was not a name, but a designation: AET Urgent, the airline's on-call aerospace engineering triage team. She ignored the commotion around her. She ignored Marcus calling her crazy. She ignored the frightened stares of the other passengers. They were all part of a world that didn't matter right now. The only thing that mattered was the truth, a truth she was about to send into the digital ether, a desperate, last-ditch message from the ghost in the machine. Her fingers hovered over the enter key. A single keystroke to bypass a world that refused to see her, a prayer that the right person was listening on the other end. She hit enter. The keystroke was silent, lost in the groaning of the fuselage, but in the digital world it was a thunderclap. The message, stripped of all pleasantries, was a shard of pure data, FLT 714. Urgent. Pylon resonance cascade failure imminent. Port Eng. Execute counter freak throttle surge Eng 1 to 102% N1 for 3 sec, followed by immediate 5-degree rudder left side slip. Maintain slip for 15 sec to shift load bearing stress to aft spar. Repeat, this is not a drill. Auth Dr. A. Thorne, lead propulsion, G-Inks 1B dev team. EMP ID 775B1. Meanwhile, the lead flight attendant, righteous and trembling with adrenaline, was unbuckling herself from her jump seat to march to the cockpit. She was going to report the delusional and disruptive passenger in 12F, a woman who was not only violating regulations but was now spouting nonsense about the engine falling off. Thousands of miles away, in a darkened, climate-controlled room in Dallas, a young systems engineer named Ben Carter nearly dropped his coffee. An alert, drenched in the highest possible priority code, had just slammed onto his monitoring screen. It hadn't come through the standard channels. It had bypassed 3 security layers and materialized directly in the AET urgent queue, a digital space reserved for codes sent by the engines themselves, not people. Ben's first thought was that it was a system glitch, a corrupted data packet, but the message was perfect, syntactically flawless. And then he saw the authorization code. Dr. A. Thorne. He didn't know the name, but he knew the employee ID series, 775B1. That was a black badge clearance, a ghost-level access code belonging to the original core development team for the G-Inks project. Most of those IDs were dormant, belonging to retired legends and academics. "No way," he whispered, his fingers flying across his keyboard. He pulled up the personnel file. Dr. Eris Thorne. The photo was a few years old, but it was her. A string of degrees from MIT and Caltech, a list of patents that made him whistle under his breath. Her current status was listed as sabbatical field research. Then he read the message again. A throttle surge on a failing engine, a deliberate sideslip. It was insane. It was counterintuitive. It violated every standard emergency procedure in the book. Standard procedure was to cut power to the failing engine, to reduce stress. This was like fighting a fire with a targeted explosion. It was either an act of sheer genius or utter madness. He had less than a second to decide. He could flag it as a potential hoax, send it up the chain of command for verification. That would take minutes. According to the telemetry data now screaming across his screen from Flight 714, they didn't have minutes. Ben made a choice. He trusted the math. He hit a single key, appending his own top-level authorization, and routed the message directly to the cockpit of Flight 714 with a single, preceding line. Directive from EAT. Execute immediately. On the plane, the flight attendant was knocking on the cockpit door just as the ICAR's printer began to spit out Ben's relayed message. The co-pilot ripped it from the machine and stared. "What is this?" the captain demanded, his hands fighting the controls as another wave of vibration shook the plane. "AET directive, sir. It's unconventional." He read Aris's instructions aloud. The captain's knuckles were white. "Surge the failing engine. Are they crazy? It'll tear the wing off." "Telemetry is redlining across the board, Captain. Whatever we're doing isn't working." The plane groaned, a deep, tortured sound of metal being stretched beyond its limits. Aris, back in 12F, felt it in her teeth. It was the final prelude to failure. "We're out of options," the captain said, his voice grim. He looked at his co-pilot. "Do it, exactly as it says." The co-pilot's hands moved with practiced speed. He disengaged the auto throttle. "Engaging manual override, rudder at my command." "God help us," the captain muttered. The passengers felt it instantly. Instead of slowing, the left engine roared with a sudden, terrifying power. The plane surged, pushing everyone back into their seats. The flight attendant who had been about to report Aris was thrown against the bulkhead, her face a mask of pure shock. This was exactly what the crazy woman had been talking about. Then, just as the roar reached its peak, the plane yawed violently to the left. The entire 200-ton machine banked at an angle that felt utterly, terrifyingly wrong, as if it were trying to fly sideways through the sky. The world outside Aris's window tilted into a dizzying blur of cloud and sky. For the first time since she boarded the plane, Aris Thorne closed her eyes. Her work was done. Her message had been delivered and impossibly heard. Now physics would decide the rest. For 15 eternal seconds, the world flew sideways. Inside the cabin, gravity became a malevolent stranger, pulling everything and everyone against the right side wall. Loose items, magazines, phones, a stray shoe slid across the floor. Passengers were pinned to their seats, their screams swallowed by the deafening roar of the overstressed engine and the shriek of the wind. Marcus had his eyes squeezed shut, his knuckles white as he gripped his armrests, his champagne-fueled arrogance replaced by the primal, whimpering terror of a man confronted with his own mortality. Aris remained calm, a silent anchor in the storm. Her eyes were closed, not in fear, but in intense concentration. She was feeling the physics of her command, tracking the shift of 10 tons of aerodynamic force from one structural point to another. She counted the seconds in her head, feeling the change as the catastrophic resonant frequency was disrupted, broken apart by the new vector of force. The deep, bone-jarring vibration that had been shaking the plane apart began to subside, replaced by the smoother, more stable buffet of the sideslip. And then, as precisely as she had calculated, it was over. The roar of the port engine eased and the plane began a slow, deliberate roll back to a level flight path. The unnatural pull of gravity receded. The screaming softened into ragged, gasping sobs. The deep, rhythmic shudder that had been the plane's death rattle for the past hour was gone. All that remained was the steady, reassuring drone of 2 functioning engines. A fragile, tearful silence descended upon the cabin. People looked at each other, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning relief. They were alive, A moment later, the captain's voice, heavy with exhaustion and disbelief, crackled through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain." He took a shaky breath. We have managed to work through that patch of severe atmospheric disturbance. We appear to have stabilized the aircraft." He paused, and the entire cabin held its breath. I've never seen anything like it, but we are stable, we are flying." The cabin erupted, not with applause at first, but with a wave of raw, guttural relief, weeping, laughter that was half sob. Strangers reached out to touch the shoulders of the person next to them. They had been to the edge, and the pilots, the heroic, unseen figures in the cockpit, had pulled them back. "Incredible!" Marcus shouted, his color returning to his face. He was the first to start clapping, a loud, performative display of his renewed confidence. "Absolutely incredible skill. Best pilots in the world. They deserve a medal." The applause spread, growing into a thunderous ovation for the anonymous heroes in the cockpit. Passengers were cheering, wiping tears from their eyes, thanking God, thanking the pilots. The lead flight attendant, who had been strapped into her jump seat, unbuckled herself on shaky legs. Her training told her to reassure the passengers, but her eyes were drawn down the aisle to seat 12F. She saw Eris, sitting perfectly still amidst the celebration, her expression not one of relief, but of grim, focused intensity. The attendant's mind replayed the scene from minutes before, the woman's insane-sounding technical jargon, the laptop, the urgent warning, and then the plane executing a maneuver that defied all logic. A cold seed of suspicion, too wild to be believed, too coincidental to be dismissed, began to sprout in her mind. But she pushed it down. It was impossible, it had to be. Eris didn't hear the applause. Her attention was fixed on her screen. The data confirmed that the maneuver had worked exactly as intended. The resonant cascade had been halted. The immediate stress on the pylon had dropped by 90%, but the victory was a temporary one. The underlying microfracture was still there, a deep, unhealable wound in the plane's skeleton. The sideslip had bought them time to get on the ground, but it had not solved the problem. Worse, the maneuver itself had subjected the rest of the wing assembly to immense, albeit brief, stress. New simulations were already running on her screen. The prognosis was clear. They had, at most, 90 minutes of structural integrity remaining before the weakened components around the initial fracture would begin to fail. The applause for the pilots finally died down. An atmosphere of giddy, post-crisis camaraderie filled the cabin. They had survived. Eris didn't join in. She just stared at the new numbers flickering on her screen. The maneuver hadn't saved them. It had only reset the clock. And now, with everyone, including the pilots, believing the danger had passed, her real fight was about to begin. The calm was more dangerous than the storm had been. A wave of false security washed through the cabin, bringing with it a return to the petty hierarchies of before. The adrenaline of near-death faded, and passengers, emboldened by their survival, began to reclaim their roles. For Marcus, this meant re-establishing his dominance. He saw Eris, still hunched over her laptop, her brow furrowed in concentration, and saw not a fellow survivor, but a loose thread in the fabric of the order he understood. He flagged down the lead flight attendant, his voice low but carrying. "You need to do something about her," he said, gesturing with his chin toward 12F. "She was on that machine the entire time. Who's to say she didn't interfere with the plane systems? In this day and age, you can't be too careful. She's a security risk." The flight attendant, who was still trying to reconcile the impossible coincidence she had witnessed, found her footing in the familiar territory of a passenger complaint. Dealing with a security risk was a clear protocol. It was easier to process than the terrifying possibility that the woman in economy had somehow saved them. She approached Eris, her expression now a mask of grim authority. An air marshal, a quiet, broad-shouldered man who had been seated in the front of the economy section, stood up and moved to subtly flank her. "Ma'am," the attendant said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "I've received a formal complaint. You have repeatedly refused to follow crew instructions regarding electronic devices. At this time, I need you to power down your laptop and hand it over." It will be returned to you after we have landed. Eris looked up, her eyes tired but sharp. You don't understand. This isn't over. You need to tell the pilots to declare an emergency and find the nearest runway. The wing's integrity is severely compromised. You have a little over an hour before the stress fractures cascade. That's enough, the attendant said, her hand outstretched. The pilots have the situation under control. Give me the laptop, now. The air marshal took a half step closer. Marcus was watching from between the curtains, a smug, satisfied smirk on his face. This was justice as he understood it, the weird, non-compliant woman being put back in her place. Eris saw the walls closing in. They were going to take her tools. They were going to silence her. And everyone on board was going to die, lulled into a false sense of safety while the clock on the wing ticked down. Arguing was futile. They were deaf to her words. She had to speak to the plane itself. With a sigh that looked like resignation, she nodded. Okay, she whispered. You're right. Her fingers moved to the keyboard, appearing to initiate the shutdown sequence. The flight attendant relaxed slightly, believing she had finally gained compliance. But Eris wasn't shutting the system down. In a blur of keystrokes that took less than 3 seconds, she entered a final, desperate command. It was a kill code of sorts, not for the plane systems, but for the layers of diagnostic filters that buffered the pilots from raw data. Her command, Override Filter Protocol struck tint 775B1, would force the dozens of microsensors on the wing assembly to report their true, unfiltered status directly to the cockpit's main ICAS display. It would trigger a red-level, non-negotiable structural integrity alarm that no pilot could dismiss as a glitch. It was an act of digital mutiny, a flare sent up from the cargo hold. And it would be a beacon, easily traceable back to her. She closed the lid of the laptop just as the flight attendant's fingers touched it. Thank you for your cooperation, the attendant said, taking the machine from her. She turned to hand it to the air marshal. And in that exact moment, the cockpit was flooded with a cacophony of alarms, a blaring, repeating siren that signified the most severe class of emergency. Every screen in front of the pilots flashed with a terrifying, unambiguous message in bold red letters. Structural integrity failure. Wing spar fracture detected. Immediate descent and landing required. The captain's voice, stripped of every last shred of calm, exploded over the intercom, a raw cry of pure alarm that cut through the entire plane. Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Flight 714. We have a major structural integrity failure. This is not a drill. We are declaring an emergency and requesting immediate vectors to the nearest airport. The false calm of the cabin shattered into a million pieces. The flight attendant froze, the warm, inert laptop still in her hands. She turned slowly, her face ashen, and stared at the woman in seat 12F. The woman she had just silenced. The woman who, impossibly, had known this was coming all along. The captain's mayday call acted like a switch, flipping the cabin from a state of anxious calm to one of outright pandemonium. The carefully constructed facade of commercial aviation, the polite smiles, the gentle chimes, the illusion of control, disintegrated in an instant. Screams erupted. A man in the row ahead of Eris began to pray loudly in Spanish. Another fumbled with the oxygen mask that had dropped from the ceiling, his hands shaking too violently to secure it. The flight attendant stood frozen in the aisle, Eris's inert laptop clutched in her hand like a strange, incriminating idol. Her eyes were locked on Eris, her face a canvas of dawning horror. The air marshal was on his feet, his calm authority dissolving as he scanned the panicked faces, unsure of what threat to address first. In the cockpit, the atmosphere was one of disciplined chaos. The pilots weren't panicking, they were executing. Their training had drilled this moment into their muscle memory. Declaring an emergency with ATC, the co-pilot said, his voice tight as he rattled off their coordinates. Structural failure, port side wing, requesting immediate vectors to the nearest suitable airport. What the hell was that alarm? The captain demanded, his hands wrestling with the controls as the plane, now officially wounded, handled like a brick. The system was clear a minute ago. It's a hard override, sir, the co-pilot said, reading the diagnostic code. It's bypassing the diagnostic filters. This data is raw. Looks like the stress loads are critical. He paused, his eyes scanning another screen. Sir, this data aligns with that AET directive we received. The frequency cascade, the load-bearing stress. It's the same signature. The captain's mind pieced it together in a flash of terrible clarity. The insane-sounding maneuver hadn't just been a lucky guess. It had been a precise, calculated intervention from someone who knew exactly what was happening. Someone who had seen this coming. That directive hadn't just stabilized them. It had bought them the precious minutes they were now using to stay alive. Flight 714, the voice of an air traffic controller crackled in their headsets, steady and grounding. Vector to Travis Air Force Base, heading 290. The field is being cleared for you. Be advised, you have an escort. 2 F-22 Raptors are off your port side to provide visual assessment and guide you in. Eris heard the distant, thunderous tier of jet engines before she saw them. She leaned closer to the window, her breath fogging the cold pane. Two shapes, sleek and deadly as arrowheads, materialized from the dense cloud cover. They moved with an impossible grace, apex predators of the sky, their dark gray fuselages a stark contrast to the white of the commercial liner. They took up formation, one slightly above the wing, the other slightly below, their pilots becoming the external eyes for the wounded giant. A passenger across the aisle gasped, pointing. Are those fighter jets? The sight of the military escort sent a new wave of terror and awe through the cabin. This was real. This was happening. Then, the F-22 flying just below the wing did something extraordinary. It broke formation, its engines flaring as it ascended with breathtaking speed, pulling up until it was perfectly parallel with Eris's window. It was so close she could see the rivets on its skin, the intricate details of its cockpit. The pilot, a helmeted, anonymous figure, turned his head. He looked, she was sure of it, directly at her. And then he raised his gloved right hand to his helmet in a slow, deliberate, and unmistakable salute. It was a gesture of profound respect, a silent acknowledgement from one of the world's most elite aviators to the unassuming woman in seat 12F. Time seemed to slow. The chaotic noise of the cabin faded into a dull roar. There was only the silent, powerful tribute, hanging in the air between two aircraft, between two worlds. Marcus, who had been muttering about lawsuits and incompetence, saw it. His jaw went slack. What is he doing? He stammered. Is he saluting? The flight attendant saw it, and the cold seed of suspicion within her blossomed into a horrifying, undeniable truth. The salute hung in the air for a long, surreal moment. A silent, stunning tribute from a world of elite power to a world of hidden genius. And in that moment, the entire social order of Flight 714 began to fracture, its flimsy hierarchies and cruel judgments vaporized by an act of respect so profound, it defied all understanding. The F-22 held the salute for a heartbeat longer, a gesture that seemed to stretch time, before dipping its wing in a final, silent acknowledgement and peeling away to rejoin its partner. The cabin of Flight 714 remained in a state of suspended animation. The immediate, screaming panic had been replaced by a deep, unsettling confusion. Every passenger who had seen the salute was now staring, openly and unabashedly, at the woman in seat 12F. They looked at her worn hoodie, her tired eyes, and the impossible image of the fighter jet's tribute, trying to reconcile the two. Marcus was on his feet, leaning into the aisle, his face a mask of utter bewilderment. What the hell was that? He demanded to no one in particular. Who is she? The question was a raw admission of his worldview's collapse. The categories he used to sort the world, rich, poor, important, invisible, had suddenly become useless. It was then that the captain's voice returned to the intercom. The static crackle was the same, but the voice was entirely different. Gone was the clipped terror of the Mayday call, and gone was the strained professionalism from before. This was the voice of a man who had just walked through fire and was now trying to describe the angel who had led him out. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "This is your captain speaking. I know you are all frightened and confused, and you deserve an explanation." A profound hush fell over the cabin. Even the sound of weeping seemed to cease. "About 20 minutes ago," the captain continued, "this aircraft was in a state of cascading structural failure. To be blunt, we were minutes, perhaps seconds, away from the port side engine detaching from the wing. Our standard emergency procedures were having no effect." He paused, and the weight of those words settled into the recycled air. They had been that close. "We then received a highly unusual directive through an emergency engineering channel. It detailed a radical, high-risk maneuver that went against every procedure in my training manual. But we were out of time, and we took a leap of faith. That maneuver is the reason we are stable right now. It is the reason we are still flying." The passengers exchanged confused, frightened glances. What did that have to do with the woman in economy? "We believed that directive came from our command center on the ground." The captain's voice cracked slightly. "We have just learned that we were wrong. The directive, and a subsequent system-wide alarm that gave us a true reading of the damage, did not come from the ground. It came from someone on this plane." The silence was now absolute, breathless. "The passenger in seat 12F, the captain said, his voice ringing with a reverence that vibrated through the cabin, "is Dr. Eris Thorne. According to the Air Force, who intercepted her emergency data burst, she is the lead propulsion scientist and metallurgist who designed the core components of the G-Inks engines on this aircraft. Her knowledge, her quick thinking, and her courage in the face of everything, has, without any exaggeration, saved every single one of our lives. The Air Force escort and the salute you may have witnessed were for her." The revelation detonated in the cabin like a silent bomb. A wave of shock, so potent it was almost visible, rippled from passenger to passenger. Eyes widened, jaws dropped, and then the wave of shock was followed by a tidal wave of shame. Marcus stumbled back into his seat as if physically struck. The blood drained from his face. Every mocking word, every sneer, every laugh at her expense replayed in his mind, now drenched in the horrifying acid of the truth. He had laughed at his savior. He had called her a nobody. He shrunk into his plush leather seat, desperately wishing it could swallow him whole. The lead flight attendant, still standing in the aisle, looked down at the laptop in her hands. A moment ago, it had been contraband, a symbol of a difficult passenger's defiance. Now it was a sacred object, the very tool of their salvation. Her face crumpled. With tears streaming down her cheeks, she walked the longest, most humbling walk of her life down the aisle to seat 12F. She stopped before Eris and held out the laptop, her hands trembling. "Doctor," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. "Dr. Thorne. I am so sorry." Eris looked from the attendant's tear-streaked face to the faces of the passengers staring at her with awe and remorse. She felt no triumph, no desire for revenge, only a deep, bone-weary sadness for a world that made such battles necessary. She simply nodded, her expression one of quiet grace, and took back her laptop. The descent to Travis Air Force Base was the quietest flight Eris had ever been on. The chaos had receded, leaving a heavy, contemplative silence in its wake. There were no murmurs, no clinking of glasses, no rustling of magazines. There was only the sound of the engines, now a steady, reassuring hum, and the collective breathing of 300 souls contemplating a miracle. The passengers were no longer strangers to each other. They were survivors, bound by a shared moment of terror and an even more profound moment of revelation. Their eyes kept drifting toward seat 12F, not with the intrusive stare of curiosity, but with a new, timid reverence, as if looking at a sacred site. Through the window, Eris watched the golden landscape of California rise to meet them. The runway, a long, perfect ribbon of black asphalt, was lined with fire trucks and ambulances, their lights flashing in a silent, urgent welcome. The sight was a stark reminder of the alternate reality they had so narrowly escaped, a world of wreckage and sorrow that existed now only in the ghost data on her laptop. The plane's wheels touched the tarmac with a gentle, final kiss. A collective sigh, soft and ragged, moved through the cabin. They were on the ground. They were safe. As the plane taxied toward a waiting ground crew, the healing began. It started with a whisper. An older woman seated a few rows back leaned into the aisle. "Thank you," she mouthed to Eris, her hand pressed to her heart. Eris simply nodded in return. One by one, as if a spell had been broken, others followed. A young man who had been ostentatiously reading a finance journal dropped it on his seat, met Eris's eyes, and gave a deep, respectful nod. The nervous passenger who had recoiled from her now leaned toward her, his voice thick with emotion. "I am so ashamed of how I acted. So sorry. Thank you." Then came Marcus. He waited until the plane had come to a complete stop, the engines powering down into a final, peaceful silence. He walked the few steps from his business-class pod, through the now irrelevant curtain, and stood in the economy aisle. All his bravado, his swagger, his armor of wealth and privilege was gone. He looked smaller, his expensive tracksuit suddenly looking like a costume. He couldn't quite meet her eyes. "Dr. Thorne," he began, his voice raspy and unfamiliar. He swallowed hard. I have never been so profoundly wrong about another human being in my entire life. The things I said, the way I acted, there is no excuse for it." He finally looked at her, his eyes glistening with a shame that was raw and real. "You have every right to hate me. I had to say thank you for my life, for everyone's." Eris looked at the man who had been her chief tormentor. She saw no satisfaction in his brokenness, no pleasure in his humiliation. She only saw a person who had been forced to look past his own reflection and see another human being for the first time. "Everyone deserves to get home safely, sir," she said, her voice even and devoid of malice. It was not forgiveness, but it was grace. It was more than he deserved, and they both knew it. The cockpit door opened. The captain emerged, his uniform crisp but his face etched with the exhaustion of the ordeal. He strode down the aisle, bypassing everyone, and stopped at her row. He was an older man, with silver at his temples and the steady, clear eyes of a lifelong pilot. "Dr. Thorne," he said, his voice full of a gratitude so immense it seemed to fill the small space. "On behalf of my co-pilot and my entire crew, we owe you our lives. I've been flying for 35 years, and I've never seen anything like what you did today. Your seat may have been 12F, but you were our true north." He extended a hand. She took it, and he held it firmly, a silent transfer of respect from one professional to another. He then turned to the cabin and spoke into the intercom one last time. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be deplaning shortly. We ask that you remain in your seats. Dr. Eris Thorne will be the first to disembark." The air marshal, the same man who had been seconds away from restraining her, now stood at attention by the forward exit, his expression a mixture of awe and professional deference. He was no longer her guard. He was her honor guard. He nodded to her as she approached the open door. The recycled air of the cabin gave way to the crisp, clean air of the California evening. Below her, on the tarmac, a small crowd of uniformed Air Force officers and civilian officials stood waiting, their faces turned up toward her. Her ordeal was over. Her new life was just beginning. As Eris stepped onto the mobile staircase, the chaotic energy of the tarmac resolved into a scene of disciplined order. The flashing lights of the emergency vehicles painted the evening in strobing blues and reds. A cordon of Air Force security personnel kept a respectful distance, their presence a silent testament to the gravity of the event. At the bottom of the stairs, a figure detached from the small group of officials and walked forward to meet her. She was a woman in a crisp Air Force dress uniform, 2 silver stars gleaming on each shoulder. Her face was sharp, intelligent, and etched with authority. "Dr. Thorne," the woman said, her voice clear and direct. She extended a hand. "I'm General Carol Miller, commanding officer of the 60th Air Mobility Wing. On behalf of the United States Air Force, I want to formally thank you." Eris shook her hand, a bit taken aback by the formality. I just did what anyone with the data would have done." General Miller's eyes held a glint of professional admiration. "Few people have the data, Doctor. Even fewer would know what to do with it in a situation like that." She gestured toward the wounded aircraft. "Your emergency data burst was intercepted by NORAD's Aerospace Command almost the instant you sent it. We were watching. What you did up there," she paused, a small, wry smile touching her lips, "is already being studied at the Pentagon. They're calling it the Thorne Maneuver." The name felt foreign, clinical, a label for an act that had felt so intensely personal. We've been trying to solve a persistent resonance issue in our next-generation hypersonic program for the better part of a year, the general continued, getting straight to the point. Our best minds have been stumped. After witnessing your real-time diagnostic and problem-solving capabilities today, I've been authorized by the Joint Chiefs to make you an offer. She didn't wait for a response. I'm creating a new rapid response aerospace division, a red team for when our most advanced machines fail. I want you to lead it. No red tape, full top-secret clearance, and a budget that would make most defense contractors weep. You'd answer only to me. The offer was staggering, a quantum leap from the quiet life of research and overlooked consultancy she had been living. It was more than a job. It was a validation on a scale she had never imagined. Eris looked from the general's unwavering gaze to the massive, wounded plane, and then at her own hands. These were the hands that had been deemed fit only to be judged, not to be trusted. "I'd need to see the data on your resonance issue first," Eris said, the engineer in her instinctively taking precedence over everything else. General Miller broke into a genuine, brilliant smile. "I was hoping you'd say that." A young airman approached, carrying Eris's scuffed, overstuffed backpack. He held it out to her with the same reverence he might have shown for a decorated flag. She took it, the familiar weight of grounding presence. The object of their scorn was the emblem of her power. She slung it over the shoulder of her simple hoodie, the contrast between her humble appearance and the world-altering offer she had just received creating a powerful, silent statement. As the general began to escort her toward a waiting black car, she passed the other passengers of Flight 714. They were being quietly guided toward buses that would take them for debriefing and medical checks. They watched her go, their faces filled with a mixture of awe, gratitude, and shame. Marcus was among them, his head bowed, refusing to look at her. But Eris's attention was caught by a different face. A young black girl, no older than 10 or 11, stood beside her mother, her hand clutching her mother's coat. She wasn't looking at the flashing lights, the fighter jets, or the uniformed soldiers. She was looking only at Eris. Her eyes were wide, not with fear but with a dawning, brilliant sense of wonder. In Eris, she was not just seeing a hero, she was seeing a possibility. Eris met the young girl's gaze across the bustling tarmac. For a long moment, the two of them were the only people in the world. Eris gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod, a shared secret, a passing of the torch. The world would remember the story of the hero in seat 12F. The news would celebrate her. But for Dr. Eris Thorne, the true legacy of that day wasn't in the job offers or the accolades. It was in the unwavering eyes of the young girl who was watching her walk away. It was a silent promise that the next time a brilliant woman was told to be quiet, the world might just be ready to listen. The black car didn't take Eris to a hotel. It delivered her to a quiet, secure guest house on the Air Force Base, a place reserved for visiting dignitaries and high-level consultants. The room was Spartan but comfortable, a world away from her cramped city apartment. For 2 days, she was debriefed by teams from the NTSB, the FA, and the Air Force. They listened to her with a focused, almost reverent attention, recording every detail of her analysis, every nuance of her calculation. They treated her not as a passenger, but as the investigation's primary expert. Meanwhile, the story of Flight 714 had exploded. The media, hungry for a hero in a fractured world, latched onto the narrative with ferocious intensity. Headlines blossomed across the internet. The angel of 12F, the woman who heard the whispers, from economy seat to national hero. News channels played grainy cell phone footage of the F-22 salute on a loop. Pundits debated the implications, while Marcus, identified through flight manifests and passenger interviews, became a public pariah overnight, a national symbol of arrogant ignorance. His company's stock plummeted, and he issued a groveling public apology that was universally mocked. Eris watched it all from the quiet remove of the guest house, the sensationalism feeling strange and disconnected from the mathematical reality she had inhabited. They were telling the story of a miracle. She knew she had simply done her job. On the 3rd day, General Miller escorted her to her new place of work. It was a nondescript, windowless building in a remote part of the base, a place that didn't appear on any public maps. Inside, however, it was a cathedral of science. A massive, open-plan laboratory hummed with the quiet energy of brilliant minds at work. Engineers huddled around holographic displays, physicists scribbled equations on floor-to-ceiling glass whiteboards, and the low, powerful thrum of a wind tunnel could be felt through the floor. "Welcome to the Skunk Works," General Miller said, using the colloquial term for the Advanced Development Program. Or, as of today, your new office. As they walked through the lab, the work didn't stop, but heads turned. People looked at Eris with a curiosity that was purely professional. They weren't seeing the woman from the news, they were seeing the scientist whose name was now attached to a legendary feat of engineering instinct. General Miller introduced her to the lead team for the hypersonic project. They were a small, intense group of men and women, the best in their fields. There were no condescending questions, no skeptical glances. "We've read your preliminary analysis of the flight data, Doctor," said the lead aerodynamicist, a woman with sharp, intelligent eyes. "Your theory on resonant frequency amplification in composite materials. It's groundbreaking. We think it might be the key to our problem." Here, in this crucible of innovation, Eris felt a sense of belonging she hadn't realized she'd been missing for years. Her credentials were a given. Her expertise was the only currency that mattered. That afternoon, the CEO of the airline called her personally. His voice was heavy with remorse. He apologized for the behavior of his crew, for a corporate culture that could allow someone of her caliber to be so utterly overlooked. He informed her they were immediately implementing the Dr. Eris Thorne Initiative, a company-wide program designed to identify and utilize the hidden skills of all their employees, from baggage handlers to gate agents. "You didn't just save an aircraft, Doctor," the CEO said. "You forced us to see our own blindness. You've made this company better." Later that evening, alone in the quiet of her temporary office, Eris unpacked her worn backpack. She placed the encrypted hard drives in a secure locker, set the spectral analyzer on a shelf, and took out her old dog-eared paperback on quantum mechanics. She sat for a moment, just holding it, the familiar weight of connection to the quiet, focused woman she had always been. The world outside could call her a hero, an angel, a genius. But in here, she was just Eris, a scientist, a problem solver. She walked over to a massive, empty whiteboard that covered an entire wall, the blankness of it a field of pure possibility. She thought of the hypersonic resonance problem, the complex data, the immense challenge. She picked up a black marker, the cap clicking off with a sound of crisp finality. The past was a closed chapter. The future was a complex equation waiting to be solved. And for the first time in a very long time, she had all the tools and all the support she needed. 3 months later, the world had absorbed the story of Flight 714 and begun to reshape itself in its wake. The Thorne maneuver was now required reading at aviation academies, but the true ripple effect was felt far beyond the confines of aerospace engineering. The Dr. Eris Thorne Initiative at the airline had become a surprisingly potent force for change. In Chicago, a baggage handler who had been quietly taking night classes in logistics and coding for 5 years was identified and fast-tracked into the company's complex route optimization department. In Atlanta, a gate agent fluent in Somali and Amharic, who had been repeatedly passed over for promotion, was made the lead liaison for the airline's growing Horn of Africa routes. The initiative was unearthing a hidden ecosystem of talent, proving Eris's case. The most valuable resources are often the ones you aren't looking for. The story had also permanently altered the lives of those who had shared the cabin with her. The lead flight attendant, after a period of leave, had requested to be a part of the Thorne Initiative's training program, determined to help other crew members learn to see past uniforms and assumptions. And then there was Marcus. One afternoon, a handwritten letter arrived at the base, forwarded from the airline. It was from him. Eris read it with a clinical curiosity. It wasn't an apology, not in the traditional sense. It was a confession. "Dr. Thorne," it began, "the world sees what happened as your victory and my humiliation. They're not wrong. But I wanted you to know it was also my liberation. I have spent my entire life measuring my worth by the things I could buy and the people I could command. When I mocked you, I was speaking the language of a deeply insecure man. You didn't just save my life. You exposed the absolute bankruptcy of the way I was living it. I have sold my company, resigned from my boards, and am starting a foundation to provide STEM scholarships for girls in underserved communities. It is not penance. It is simply the first honest work of my life. I do not ask for your forgiveness, only that you know you created more than one miracle that day. Eris folded the letter and put it aside. His journey was his own, but the echo of it was a testament to the power of a truth that, once seen, could not be unseen. Her own life had changed in ways she was still processing. Seat 12F had entered the cultural lexicon, a shorthand for a hidden genius, a quiet expert hiding in plain sight. Memes circulated online showing her face on the body of a Jedi Knight with the caption, "Trust the science." She found the fame deeply uncomfortable, a distraction from the work itself. She turned down dozens of interview requests, book deals, and movie offers. She agreed to only one, a long-form conversation with a respected journalist known for her deep, thoughtful interviews. The interview took place not in a flashy studio but in a quiet library. Eris wore her usual simple hoodie. "Everyone wants to talk about the salute, the maneuver, the moment of revelation," the journalist said. "But what do you think the real story is?" Eris leaned forward, her expression serious. "The real story isn't that I was on that plane. Statistically, people like me, women, people of color with advanced technical degrees, are everywhere. We are in your labs, your classrooms, your service industries. The miracle of Flight 714 wasn't my presence. It was that the system, for a very brief and desperate moment, was forced to listen to a voice it was structurally designed to ignore." Her words resonated, cutting through the heroic narrative to the systemic issue beneath. "The real work," Eris concluded, "is to build a world where you don't need a crisis to be heard, where a woman's expertise is trusted on the ground, not just when you're falling from 30,000 feet. The interview was broadcast globally. In a classroom in Inglewood, California, a young girl with bright, curious eyes watched Eris on a tablet propped up on her desk. She saw not a celebrity, but a reflection of her own potential. After the interview ended, she pulled out a piece of paper and began to write. "Dear Dr. Thorne," she wrote in the careful, looping script of a child. "My name is Tiana, and I was on the plane with you. I saw the fighter jet. I want to build things that fly too. You said to build a world where we are heard. I'm going to help you." The letter would arrive at the base a week later. Another ripple from the stone dropped in the water, another echo of a quiet voice that had finally, irrevocably been heard. A year passed. The clamor of the news cycle moved on to other heroes and other crises, leaving the story of Flight 714 to settle into the realm of modern legend. For Eris, this quiet was a gift. It allowed her to disappear back into the work, which was, for her, the only place she had ever truly wanted to be. Her Red Team lab was a place of controlled and beautiful chaos. Equations sprawled across glass walls like murals, holographic engine models spun silently in mid-air, and the air itself was thick with the scent of ozone from the test chambers and the low hum of supercomputers. It was a haven of pure intellect, a place where the only hierarchy was the quality of an idea. General Miller had been true to her word. Eris had been given the resources, the authority, and the trust to build her vision from the ground up. Her team was a collection of brilliant misfits, engineers and physicists who, like her, often saw the world from unconventional angles. Among them was a young prodigy, a quiet, nervous engineer named Kenji Tanaka, who was a master of predictive modeling but often too timid to speak up in meetings. During a critical simulation of the hypersonic craft, Kenji spotted a minute data anomaly, a ghost in the machine eerily similar to the one Eris had felt on the plane. The senior engineers dismissed it as a sensor ghost, a statistical improbability. They were ready to move on, but Eris saw the hesitation in Kenji's eyes, the familiar frustration of a person who knows they're right but lacks the authority to be heard. She stopped the entire meeting. "Kenji," she said, her voice cutting through the room's momentum. "You see something. Tell us." Hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence as Eris listened with unwavering attention, Kenji explained his theory. It was a complex, counterintuitive idea about sympathetic vibrations not in the engine, but in the craft's control surfaces. It was a 1 in a billion chance. It was also, as Eris immediately recognized, absolutely brilliant. She turned to the lead engineers. Scrub the current simulation. Run Mr. Tanaka's model. Give him all the processing power he needs. 2 days later, Kenji's model predicted a catastrophic failure with 99.9% accuracy. He hadn't just saved them months of work. He had saved the entire program from a fatal design flaw. In that moment, Eris's true legacy became clear. It wasn't the maneuver that bore her name. It was the culture of listening she was now building, brick by brick. She was ensuring there would be no more unheard voices, no more ignored experts in seat 12F. Her life outside the lab was quiet and intentional. She mentored Tiana, the young girl from the flight, through weekly video calls, helping her with physics homework and encouraging her passion for flight. She still lived simply, her only indulgence a state-of-the-art telescope she set up on the balcony of her modest apartment. One evening, a small, lacquered box arrived from the airline. Inside, there was no check or offer, only a small, engraved brass plaque. It was the size of a business card. The letter accompanying it explained that the seat number 12F had been officially retired across their entire global fleet. In its place, on every plane, this small plaque was now installed. It read, in honor of Dr. Eris Thorne, who reminded us to listen. Eris held the plaque in her hand, the cool weight of it a final, quiet acknowledgement. She hadn't asked for a monument, but the airline had given her something better, a permanent, silent reminder embedded into the very system that had once dismissed her. She went to bed that night not thinking of the past, but of the future. The hypersonic resonance problem was solved. The next challenge awaited. The noise of the world had finally faded, leaving only the clean, clear signal of the work. She was home. 2 years later, Eris Thorne boarded a flight to Geneva. She was scheduled to give the keynote address at the International Symposium on Advanced Propulsion. This time, her ticket read Seat 2A. She settled into the spacious first-class pod, the supple leather a world away from the stiff economy seat she remembered. But some things hadn't changed. She still wore a soft, dark hoodie, she still had her worn paperback, and her scuffed backpack was stowed carefully in the overhead bin. She was the same woman, only the world's perception of her had been irrevocably altered. Before the cabin door was closed, the captain emerged from the cockpit. He was young, with a respectful, almost star-struck look in his eyes. "Dr. Thorne," he said, leaning down slightly. "I just wanted to say it's an absolute honor to have you on board with us today. On behalf of the entire crew, thank you for your contributions to aviation. We all fly a little safer because of you." Eris smiled, a genuine, warm expression. "Thank you, Captain. I'm happy to be along for the ride." As the flight prepared for departure, a young flight attendant, a black woman with bright, intelligent eyes, approached her pod. She was visibly nervous, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Excuse me, Dr. Thorne. I'm so sorry to bother you," she began, her voice a little shaky. "My name is Simone. I have to tell you. 2 years ago, I was a third-year aerospace engineering student at Howard. I was struggling, facing a lot of dismissal. I was about to drop out." Eris put down her book and gave the young woman her full attention. "Then the story of Flight 714 broke," Simone continued, her voice gaining strength. "And I saw you, and I heard what you said in your interview, about building a world where we don't need a crisis to be heard." Her eyes welled with tears. "You're the reason I stayed in the program. I'm flying now to pay off my loans, but I graduate next spring. You showed me there was a place for us." Eris felt a warmth spread through her chest, more profound and satisfying than any award or accolade she had ever received. This was the work. This was the true echo of that terrible, beautiful day. She reached out and gently touched the young woman's arm. "There was always a place for you, Simone," Eris said, her voice soft but sure. "All that happened was the world finally cleared you a runway. Don't ever let anyone tell you that you don't belong in the sky." The plane began its powerful pushback from the gate. Simone wiped a tear from her eye, nodded with a new, fierce determination, and returned to her duties. Eris leaned her head back against the seat and looked out the window. Below, the world was a complex tapestry of lines and lights. The engine spooled up, and she felt the familiar, perfect vibration of a machine in harmony. The plane accelerated, faster and faster, until it lifted gracefully from the earth, climbing into the boundless blue. She thought of the hierarchies, the judgments, the flimsy curtains men draw between worlds. But then she thought of Simone walking down the aisle, her future taking flight. She thought of Kenji leading a team in her lab, of Tiana sketching rockets in her notebook, of a plaque on a plane that taught people to listen. The most complex machine she had ever helped to build was not the one hanging off the wing outside her window. It was the space of possibility she had opened in the sky, a space where talent could be seen, where dignity was inherent, and where a quiet voice could be the most powerful force on Earth. And in that space, the next brilliant mind was already beginning to soar.